He dreamed of a tender bride to share his quiet ranch, but instead, two desperate widows arrived, pleading for him to save them both. Can one man's heart and honor survive a choice that could destroy them all? The wind carried a low whistle across the plains, stirring dust and grit around the wooden platform of Cinder Creek's small railway station. Elias Vane tugged his hat low against the glare, his calloused fingers clutching the letter that had lived in his coat pocket for weeks. The ink had faded with rereading, but the words were carved into his memory. I will be a gentle wife, and together we will build a quiet home. He had imagined her countless times, small, kind-eyed, soft-spoken, a balm against the years of silence that his ranch had pressed on him. The cattle gave no company, the winds no comfort. Now, after seasons of loneliness, the train's whistle promised change. The iron beast screeched to a halt, and passengers spilled onto the platform. Elias scanned every face, his heart thudding with an unaccustomed rhythm. But instead of a delicate young bride stepping shyly toward him, two women emerged together. Their clothes were worn from travel, hems frayed by dust, their eyes shadowed by grief. One held her chin high, Marin Ashford, though he did not yet know her name. There was iron in her gaze, the kind of strength born from loss. The other, Lydia Vale, lingered a step behind, her hands folded tight at her waist, her figure slight as if the wind might lift her away. They approached him as one. Are you Elias Vane? The taller woman asked, her voice steady but edged with desperation. Elias nodded once, words sticking in his throat. We're widows, she said quickly, before he could respond. Both of us. Our husbands fell to fever back in Hollow Rock. We've nothing left. No home, no family, no coin. The letter you sent? It was meant for one, but we beg you. Her voice faltered, and she looked to the quiet woman beside her. Lydia's eyes lifted, brimming with unspoken sorrow. Please, Mr. Vane, choose us both. If you don't, we may not survive. The weight of their plea pressed on him harder than any yoke he'd ever borne. He had expected one fragile bride, not two broken women clinging to hope. Around them, townsfolk paused in their business, pretending not to listen, but leaning close all the same. Elias's hand tightened around the letter. His chest burned with questions. Why had fate sent him not the gentle answer he had prayed for, but a test twice as heavy? He could turn them away. He could walk back to his ranch, shut the door, and let loneliness remain his only companion. But their eyes, one fierce, one pleading, rooted him in place. For the first time in years, Elias Vane wondered if God himself had written a crueler script for his life than he had bargained for. Two widows, one choice, and a silence stretching between them that could shatter everything he thought he wanted. If you think one bride could change a man's life, wait until you see what happens when two desperate widows ask him to choose them both. The wagon wheels creaked as Elias guided his team along the rutted trail back to his ranch. Marin and Lydia sat in the back, silent except for the occasional cough of dust in their throats. Elias kept his gaze fixed on the horizon, unsure what words could mend the strangeness of the situation. He had offered them the ride without commitment, yet even that felt like a decision that might bind him tighter than he intended. The ranch came into view as the sun lowered sturdy fences, a weathered barn, and the squat timber house Elias had built with his own hands years ago. The cattle grazed in the pasture, their dark shapes dotting the land like ink spilled on parchment. He had dreamed of bringing a bride here, filling the house with warmth. Now, two shadows followed him across the threshold instead. Stay inside, Elias said gruffly, pushing open the door. His voice carried more command than kindness, though he did not mean it harshly. It's plain but solid. You'll find water by the basin. Marin stepped in first, her eyes sweeping the bare wooden floors, the hearth cold in the corner. She set her small satchel down, with the firmness of someone determined to claim a place, however meager. Lydia hesitated on the porch before following, her hands brushing the doorframe as though asking permission. Elias busied himself with the fire, striking steel to flint until sparks caught the dry kindling. Flames licked upward, filling the room with a glow that softened the hard lines of his home. Still, unease coiled around him. He had invited them under his roof, but where did that lead? He had promised himself a wife, not two widows bound together by desperation. Marin broke the silence. "We'll work for our keep. I know how to mend fences and cook if there's enough flour. Lydia can sew near anything, and she's good with children." Her voice faltered at the last word. Children. The absence of theirs weighed heavy in the pause. Lydia lowered her gaze. "We don't ask for more than a roof and safety, Mr. Vane." Elias studied them from the firelight. Marin's strength was evident, the kind of woman who would fight off wolves with nothing but a stick if it came to it. Lydia, by contrast, seemed delicate in body, but carried a quiet grace that spoke of endurance. Two women different as night and dawn, yet bound by the same shadow of survival. "You'll stay," Elias said at last, his voice even. "For now. But you follow my rules. Work hard, no quarrels. This isn't charity, it's a ranch. Everyone pulls weight." Marin gave a sharp nod, almost relieved to be measured by labor instead of pity. Lydia whispered a soft, "Thank you," her words nearly lost to the crackle of the fire. As the night settled, Elias lay awake in his bed, listening to the hushed voices of the widows in the next room. Two strangers under his roof, two burdens he had not asked for, but perhaps, he thought as the wind rattled the shutters, two chances at something he no longer dared to name. Morning came draped in pale light, stretching long shadows across the ranch yard. Elias rose early, as he always did, but found Marin already outside, sleeves rolled, hauling water from the well. She moved with a deliberate determination, her jaw set as though every bucket drawn was a defiance against defeat. Inside, Lydia tended the hearth, coaxing flame to life beneath a skillet. The smell of corn cakes drifted through the cabin, delicate and warm. She glanced up as Elias entered, her smile faint but genuine. "Breakfast will be ready soon," she murmured, her voice softer than the rustle of dry grass. Elias nodded, though unease clung to him. They were strangers still, yet already leaving their marks on his home. He couldn't deny the stirrings of change, the sound of pans, the sight of hands, not his own at work. Still, questions pressed at him like burrs beneath the saddle. Who were these women beyond their desperation? What storms had carried them here? After breakfast, Elias set about mending a section of broken fence. Marin followed, insisting she would help. She gripped the hammer with practiced ease, driving nails into wood without hesitation. Sweat streaked her brow, but her eyes shone with something fiercer than labor, a will to prove herself. "You've worked land before," Elias remarked, surprised at her efficiency. "My father ran a small farm back east," Marin replied between strikes. "I learned early crops, cattle, tools. My husband was no rancher. He dreamed big, but left me to patch the holes." Her lips thinned. Then a fever took him. Dreams don't mend roofs. The bitterness in her tone lingered, but Elias recognized it not as cruelty, rather, as the scar of survival. Later, by the corral, Lydia sat mending a torn shirt of Elias's. Her stitches were fine, and even nimble fingers weaving order into fray. When Elias passed, she glanced up, her eyes carrying a distance beyond the present. "You've a steady hand," Elias said. "My mother taught me," Lydia whispered. "Sewing kept our household whole when nothing else could." She hesitated, the needle pausing mid-air. "I married a man who promised gentleness. But gentleness doesn't hold back sickness." He faded and left me with silence. Her words trembled, like the thread she pulled taut. Elias stood there, uncertain how to respond. He felt their grief as though it seeped into the soil beneath his boots. Marin's anger sharp as thorns, Lydia's sorrow fragile as glass. That night, around the fire, the widows spoke more. They told of Hollow Rock, a town stricken by fever, houses boarded up with families inside, prayers unanswered. Elias listened, silent, the flames painting shadows across his weathered face. He had thought loneliness the worst of burdens. Yet as their stories unfolded, he realized there were weights heavier still, the loss of trust, of hope, of belonging. And somehow, by fate or mischief, these women had been set upon his path. As he banked the fire, Elias knew one thing with certainty. His life was no longer his alone. The widow's pasts whispered through the walls of his home, and their future now rested in his hands. By the third day, whispers had already spread through Cinder Creek. A man like Elias Vane, known for solitude and silence, bringing not one but 2 widows under his roof, stirred more curiosity than a saloon brawl. And curiosity in a small town was as dangerous as drought. Elias rode into town for supplies. The creak of saddle leather and the rhythm of hooves steady against the morning air. He had left Marin and Lydia behind, with chores, Marin tending the chickens, Lydia stitching curtains from old flour sacks. The women worked hard, and though Elias admired their resilience, he knew the world beyond his fences was less forgiving. At the mercantile, the shopkeeper raised his brows, but said nothing. A few townsfolk muttered behind their hands. Elias kept his answers short, his eyes on the sacks of flour and tools he needed. Yet before he could leave, Sheriff Calder Hoyt stepped through the doorway, his long coat dusted with trail dirt and his gaze sharp as a hawk's. "Elias Vane," the sheriff drawled, tipping his hat only halfway. "Heard tell you've taken in a pair of widows." Elias's jaw tightened. He had little taste for gossip, less for lawmen meddling. They needed shelter. "Shelter," Hoyt repeated, leaning against the counter. "That may be, but words circling quicker than tumbleweed in a gale. Folks are wondering what a man like you intends, bringing 2 grieving women under one roof. Some say it's charity. Others," his eyes narrowed, "others reckon trouble." Elias's silence stretched, heavy as iron. He had no patience for town talk, but the sheriff's meaning was clear. 2 women, vulnerable and alone, were easy prey, not just for whispers, but for men with harsher aims. "They're decent women," Elias said at last, his tone clipped. Hoyt studied him a moment, then sighed. "Maybe so, but Silas Drenner's been sniffing around. You know his kind collects debts from widows like they're cattle to be branded. If those women carry even a hint of obligation from their past, Drenner will claim it." The name hit Elias like a hammer against stone. Drenner land, baron, opportunist, a man who carved profit from grief. If he'd caught wind of Marin and Lydia, their troubles had only begun. Hoyt adjusted his hat. "I don't aim to meddle in your house, Vane, but keep your eyes open. The plains ain't kind to women alone, and men like Drenner make them meaner still." Elias gave a stiff nod and gathered his supplies, the sheriff's words weighing on him all the way back to the ranch. When he returned, the sound of laughter startled him. Marin teasing Lydia as she shooed a stubborn chicken from the kitchen door. For a fleeting moment, the house felt alive, like it had years ago before silence swallowed it whole. But Hoyt's warning echoed in Elias's mind. Trouble was coming, riding the same trail as shadows at dusk, and Elias Vane knew one truth. If he was to keep the widows safe, he'd have to stand against more than whispers. He'd have to stand against men. The afternoon sun bore down heavily as Elias drove a post into the fence line, the dull thud of hammer on wood echoing across the fields. Sweat traced down his temples, but his mind was elsewhere on Sheriff Hoyt's warning, on the widow's laughter that morning, on the shadow of a name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in months. Silas Drenner. Elias knew him too well. The man had grown fat off misery, collecting debts and land the way others collected coins. He wasn't a gunfighter, nor a rancher. His power lay in influence, in the lawmen and hired hands he kept tethered to his purse. If Drenner had set his eyes on Marin and Lydia, it wouldn't be long before his shadow stretched to Cinder Creek. By evening, Elias's unease turned to certainty. The sound of hooves thundered down the trail, and a plume of dust rose against the reddening sky. A rider approached, dressed in a black coat despite the heat, silver buckles gleaming. He drew rein at the gate, his horse snorting in protest. "Elias Vane," the man called, his voice smooth as oil poured over stone. Elias straightened, hammer still in his grip. He didn't need an introduction. Silas Drenner's sharp features and wolfish smile were well known to anyone who'd lived long on these plains. "You've taken in a pair of widows," Drenner said, leaning lazily in his saddle. "Marin Ashford and Lydia Vale. Unfortunate losses, their husbands." He clicked his tongue, mock sympathy dripping from the sound. "But fortunate for me, they left behind accounts unsettled, debts owed, land unpaid. Those women carry more than sorrow. They carry an obligation." Marin stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Her gaze hardened the moment it landed on Drenner. Lydia appeared behind her, clutching the doorframe, pale as bone. "You've no claim on us," Marin shot back before Elias could speak. "My husband died owing no man." Drenner smirked. "That's where you're wrong, dear lady. Papers don't lie. And if you can't settle what's owed, well..." His gaze slid toward Lydia, lingering too long. "Other arrangements can be made." Elias felt his jaw tighten. He stepped forward, voice low but steady. "This ranch isn't your hunting ground, Drenner. Whatever claim you think you've got, it won't be settled here." The land baron's smile widened, though his eyes remained cold. "We'll see. I'll be back with proof, and perhaps a few friends to witness. Don't make the mistake of thinking silence is strength, Vane. A man alone can be broken, but men like me," he tapped his chest, "we build empires." With that, Drenner tugged his reins, turning his horse in a slow circle. Dust rose, swallowing him as he rode off into the twilight. Elias stood unmoving, Marin's defiance burning at his back, Lydia's fear like a shadow clinging to the porch. Trouble had found them sooner than he'd hoped. The widows had asked him for survival. Now, with Drenner circling, Elias wondered if survival would demand more than any of them were prepared to give. The days after Drenner's visit weighed heavily on the ranch. The widows worked as before, but a tension clung to the air, sharp as barbed wire. Elias kept busy mending fences, tending cattle, checking the perimeter more often than usual, but even labor couldn't drive away the unease crawling beneath his skin. Marin met the threat with fire. She carried herself taller, worked longer, and her words grew edged with steel. When Elias mentioned caution, she scoffed. "I've stared down hunger, sickness, and men who thought they could take what wasn't theirs. Drenner's no worse than the rest." Her boldness stirred something in Elias, a grudging respect, and perhaps more. He had asked for a delicate bride, someone to soften the edges of his solitude. Yet Marin, with her sharp tongue and iron will, was nothing delicate. She was a storm contained in human form, fierce and unyielding. Lydia, in contrast, moved through the house like a whisper. She mended clothes, kept the hearth warm, and spoke gently, her presence a balm to the roughness of the ranch. But Elias noticed the fear in her eyes. Whenever Drenner's name passed between them, she had known men like him, predators who took advantage of silence and sorrow. Her gentleness was not weakness, it was endurance, a quiet strength forged in shadow. One evening, as twilight bled across the horizon, Elias found Marin at the corral, her hands resting on the rails as she watched the horses. "You should be inside," he said. "Coyotes prowl after dusk." She turned, a wry smile tugging at her lips. "Coyotes I can handle. Men with papers and guns, that's another matter. You're not thinking of letting him win, are you?" Elias bristled. "I don't bend to men like Drenner." "Good." Her eyes flashed with approval. "Then we'll fight him, if it comes to that." The certainty in her voice sparked something dangerous in Elias's chest. For a moment, he saw not a widow begging for shelter, but a partner who could match him stride for stride. Later that same night, Elias passed by the kitchen and found Lydia quietly sewing by lamplight. The glow softened her features, making her seem almost otherworldly. She looked up, her voice trembling but steady enough to reach him. "You don't have to shoulder it all alone," she said. "You've given us a home. If Drenner comes, I'll stand with you." Her words were soft, but they cut deeper than Marin's fire. Elias felt the air leave his lungs, the weight of two promises pulling him in opposite directions. When he lay in bed, sleep refused him. Marin's fierce defiance burned like lightning. Lydia's gentleness lingered like a hymn. He had set out to claim one wife, one chance at companionship. Now his heart stood on uneasy ground, torn between two women whose survival and perhaps his own depended on him. And beyond the horizon, Elias knew Drenner was plotting, sharpening his claws for the day he would strike. The sky darkened without warning, rolling clouds piling over the mountains like an army on the march. By late afternoon, the air had turned thick and heavy, every creature on the ranch restless. The horses stamped and tossed their heads, the cattle clustered nervously at the fence line. Elias felt it in his bones, the kind of storm that split trees and tested men. "Bring the stock in close," Elias ordered, striding toward the barn. Marin was already at his side, sleeves rolled, her braid whipping loose in the wind. Lydia hurried behind, clutching her shawl tight around her shoulders. Lightning cracked across the horizon, followed by thunder that shook the ground. The storm rolled in fast, sheets of rain striking the earth in blinding torrents. Together, they worked to herd the cattle toward shelter. Marin swung a rope with practiced strength, shouting above the thunder, while Elias guided the herd with his steady hand. Lydia, though frightened, kept pace, her voice soft but firm as she coaxed a skittish calf toward safety. By the time the last animal was secured, they were drenched, mud clinging to boots and skirts alike. Elias slammed the barn doors shut, just as the full force of the storm unleashed. Inside, the three of them stood breathless, rain pounding the roof like gunfire. Marin laughed suddenly, a sharp sound breaking the tension. "Well," she said, pushing wet hair from her face, "we're alive. That counts for something." Lydia, trembling, sank onto a bale of hay. "Storms like this," her voice faltered. "They remind me of the night my husband died. Fever took him while thunder shook the walls. Every storm since feels like it will take me too." Her words silenced the barn. Elias crouched before her, his voice rough but steady. "This storm won't take you. Not while you're here." Marin placed a hand on Lydia's shoulder, her expression softer than Elias had seen it. For all her fire, she understood fear, and perhaps carried her own beneath that hardened shell. As the storm raged outside, Elias felt the weight of their presence differently. They were no longer just two widows seeking survival. They were women carrying pasts that scarred deeper than any wound. And here they were, in his barn, in his life, testing the walls he had built around himself. Hours passed before the storm began to ease, the thunder rolling farther into the distance. But the silence that followed was not peace. It was heavy with words unspoken. Elias knew the storm had stirred more than dust and rain. It had laid bare their fears, their strength, and the fragile threads binding them together. When at last they stepped back into the night air, the land glistened with water, the sky clearing to reveal a scatter of stars. Elias glanced at the women, Marin standing tall, Lydia close at her side, and knew the storm outside had mirrored the one rising within his heart. And storms, he realized grimly, never came only once. The morning after the storm, the ranch glistened beneath a pale sky. Water pooled in the furrows of the fields, and the air carried the clean, sharp scent of rain-washed earth. Yet beneath the calm, unease simmered. Elias could feel it in the way Marin moved about the yard with restless energy, in the quiet glances Lydia cast toward him when she thought he wasn't looking. By midday, the tension found its voice. Marin cornered Elias near the corral, her eyes blazing like a fire that refused to die. "You can't keep us hanging in the balance, Elias," she said, crossing her arms. "We didn't come here for endless waiting. You sent for a bride, and whether you like it or not, you've got 2 women under your roof. Which of us do you mean to claim? Elias's grip tightened on the fence post he was repairing. He had expected this moment, dreaded it. But still, the bluntness of her words struck him like a blow. Before he could answer, Lydia appeared, her hands twisting nervously around the edge of her apron. "Marin," she said softly, "perhaps this isn't the time." Marin turned on her, sharp but not cruel. "We don't have the luxury of time, Lydia. Every day we stay here without knowing our place." The town whispers louder. Drenner circles closer. Sooner or later, a choice will have to be made. Lydia flinched at Drenner's name, her face paling, but she lifted her chin. "She's right," she said quietly, her gaze meeting Elias's. "You've given us shelter, and we are grateful, but we cannot live in uncertainty forever. Tell us where we stand." Elias set down his tools, the silence stretching heavy between them. He had faced storms, stampedes, and the harsh bite of winter, but nothing had prepared him for this, the weight of 2 women's futures resting in his hands. "I don't make choices lightly," he said at last, his voice rough. "I asked for one bride because I thought a wife would mend the silence of this place. Instead, fate brought me 2 widows, with burdens heavier than my own. If I choose one, I betray the other. If I choose neither, I betray you both. And I can't do that, not yet." Marin's jaw tightened, her pride stung by the hesitation. "So we just keep working, keep waiting, until you decide if we're worth it?" Lydia's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, though her voice was calm. "Perhaps he isn't ready to decide at all." The words cut Elias deeper than he expected. He wanted to answer, to lay truth bare, but no words came. At length, Marin turned away, her shoulders rigid. "Then don't keep us in the dark forever, Elias, because indecision is its own kind of cruelty." She strode back toward the house, Lydia trailing behind, leaving Elias alone by the corral. He leaned on the fence rail, staring out across the soaked pasture, the storm still echoing in his chest. The choice loomed like a mountain before him, immovable, inescapable. And every day he delayed, the shadow of Silas Drenner grew longer across the horizon. The wind carried a warning that morning, hot, dry, and sharp with grit. Elias sensed it before he saw the dust plume rising on the eastern trail. He stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, eyes narrowing as riders emerged from the haze. 4 men, armed and grim. At their head rode Silas Drenner, his black coat flaring behind him like a vulture's wings. Marin came to the doorway, her jaw set. "He's brought others." Lydia hovered just inside, pale but steady. "What does he want this time?" Elias's voice was hard. "The same thing he always wants. To take what isn't his." The riders pulled up at the gate, horses stamping impatiently. Drenner raised a gloved hand, his smile smug. "Elias Vane, I told you I'd be back with proof." He produced a folded packet from his coat, waving it like a banner. "These papers say the Ashfords and the Vales owed me seed, tools, and land rights. Their husbands died before settling. That debt is mine to claim." Marin stepped forward, fury in her voice. "My husband never owed you. You forged those lies." Drenner's grin widened. "Maybe, maybe not. But in this territory, paper speaks louder than widows' words. Unless, of course," his gaze lingered on Lydia, sharp and cruel. "Unless someone here is willing to bargain." Elias raised his rifle, the barrel glinting in the sunday. "You'll bargain with lead before you touch either of them." The hired guns shifted in their saddles, hands inching toward pistols. For a breathless moment, the air thickened with the promise of violence. Then Lydia stepped onto the porch, her voice trembling but clear. "You think widows are weak, Drenner, that we'll bow to threats. But you're wrong. We've buried husbands, children, and homes. There's nothing left you can take that we haven't already lost." Her words struck harder than Elias's rifle. Even Marin glanced at her. startled by the steel beneath her softness. Drenner sneered, but his eyes flickered with unease. Fine speeches won't pay debts. No, Elias growled, leveling his rifle square at him. But men like you understand something better than words. You understand when a town turns its back on you. As if summoned, figures began to appear along the road: neighbors, ranch hands, even Sheriff Hoyt. Word of Drenner's threats had spread, and Cinder Creek had come to watch. The sheriff's voice rang out. You'll put those papers away, Drenner. No law in this county will uphold them. The land baron's smirk faltered. He looked from Elias to the gathered townsfolk, the weight of their stares pressing down like judgment. For all his bravado, Drenner thrived in shadows, not under the eyes of a town united. With a sharp tug of the reins, he turned his horse. This isn't over, he spat. You'll regret standing against me. The riders wheeled and galloped off, leaving a haze of dust in their wake. Elias lowered his rifle, heart pounding. Marin exhaled hard, defiance still blazing. Lydia, though trembling, stood straighter than he'd ever seen her. The fight wasn't finished. Drenner would return. But for now, the widows had stood, the town had rallied, and Elias knew something had shifted. This ranch was no longer just his. It was theirs, bound in blood and dust. Weeks passed after Drenner's retreat, but his shadow lingered on the edge of Cinder Creek. Elias kept his rifle close, watchful as ever, yet no riders returned. Perhaps it was the town's unity. Perhaps Drenner had shifted his gaze to easier prey, but for now, peace held. The ranch began to breathe again. Where once silence ruled, voices filled the days. Maren's strong laughter carried across the yard as she split kindling with quick, sure strikes. Lydia's soft singing drifted from the kitchen, weaving warmth into the timber walls. The land itself seemed changed, grass greener, fences straighter, cattle fattening under careful eyes. Elias stood one morning on the porch, hat in hand, watching as the two women moved about their tasks. He had thought he wanted only one bride, someone gentle to soften the loneliness. But the widows had given him more than softness. They had given him fire, grace, and a reason to speak again when silence once felt safer. That evening, as dusk painted the sky in gold and violet, Elias gathered them at the long table. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a glow over their faces. Marin fierce and unyielding, Lydia tender and steady. He cleared his throat, a rare weight in his words. When I wrote that letter, he began, I asked for a bride because I thought one woman might save me from the emptiness here. But fate sent me two, and I've wrestled with that ever since. The truth is, I can't choose between you, because it isn't a choice. You've both saved me, in ways I didn't know I needed. Marin's brows lifted, skepticism flickering, before softening into something gentler. Lydia lowered her eyes, tears glinting, but her smile trembled with relief. Elias leaned forward, his hands resting firm on the table. This ranch is no longer mine alone. It's ours if you'll have it. I don't ask either of you to be less than you are, or to compete for what can't be measured. I ask only that we face what comes together, as a family. For a long moment, silence held. Then Marin's hand slid across the table, calloused fingers gripping his. If it means standing against the world, I'll do it, she said simply. Lydia's hand joined theirs, soft and steady. I only ever wanted a home again. You've given that to me. The three sat bound together, not by law or letter, but by survival, choice, and the strange mercy of fate. In the weeks that followed, the ranch grew into something more than land and cattle. Flowers Lydia planted along the porch bloomed in bursts of color. Marin repaired the barn roof, her determination turning ruin to strength. Elias spoke more freely, his voice carrying across the fields like a man reborn. And when neighbors came, they no longer saw a silent rancher, they saw a household alive with resilience. Cinder Creek still whispered, as towns always do, but the whispers no longer mattered. Elias Vane had not chosen one delicate bride. He had chosen two widows, and together they had forged something fiercer than gossip, stronger than fear. And for the first time in years, Elias felt he had not just a house, but a home. If you liked this story, please hit like and subscribe. See you in the next video.